Or it.
Unmute. We're live.
Awesome.
Hey, buddy.
Hello, Joe.
All right. So let's hop right into it. Putu. Um, let's talk about noise.
Okay.
Um, what is noise? What does that mean?
Oh man. This is something I've been trying to define for myself and for my research for the past 10 years or so, and it's really hard to pinpoint anything substantial without contextualizing it to either a cultural process or a time period. And so largely for me, noise is any entity, whether sonic or ideological, that tends to um, disrupt a status quo, whether that is for a long temporal period or for a short temporal period, such as a ceremony or something like that.
Mm.
So, more specific to my research on sort of heavy musics or things that are ostensibly loud and aggressive in Bali and in the US, with between like heavy metal and kind of gamelan balaganjur. I tend to look at those things through the lens of noise and cosmology, or noise and politics, because they're really tied to this sort of disruption, whether it's against a particular political ideology, which we can get into a little later, or whether that is for the cosmological balance, literally to create noise for the cosmological balance of the community within a ceremony. So I've largely categorized for myself, and categories for me, I will preface with that they tend not to do that much for me because of how often it changes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you've experienced a little bit of that as we've been talking. Um, but these sort of contextual categories of noise are really useful because they are intended to disrupt through um, an affect of comfort. And so what I mean by that is oftentimes when these sort of performances or enactments of noise exist, rarely is it only to disrupt or push back against something. It's also to provide support to a cause, whatever that may be. Um, I think that's the easiest answer I can give you right now.
Yeah, that's there's a lot to dig into there. I think for me the if I had to give it, I definitely haven't thought about what noise means as much as you. And certainly not in the same context, but if I had to give a definition, it would be something along the same lines. I think when I think of noise, especially in sort of um the there seems to be an inherent contradiction between the idea of noise and music. They're sort of contraposites of each other.
Mhm.
Um, uh, it can be difficult to answer because first you have to answer the question of what is music in the first place. But I think with noise, I'm with you with a lot of that. I think for me, a lot of times it comes down to um, really it does come down to this idea of it's something that's disruptive to the normal flow, the normal sort of status quo of something.
Mhm.
Um, so if you would, will you give a definition of Balaganjar, and then maybe talk a little bit about how it's how it ties into this idea of noise as disruption?
Sure, and I'll start with sort of my own working definition of how I see what music is, and the easiest for me when I define music is that it's humanly organized,
Mm-hmm.
and there's arguments around how those things are organized, or if animals have the capacity to perform music and things like that. But for the context of talking about balagandur, I tend to talk about music as humanly organized in some capacity. So the organization of Bala Ganjur and its definition and its sort of ontology, its categorization of being, tends to be it's processional music in Hindu Balinese cosmologies and communities that are deemed essential by Hindu Balinese people. And I want to reiterate that it's for Hindu Balinese communities specifically, because there's, when you look at the island of Bali or even Balinese arts outside of Indonesia, there are contexts in which things even like gamelan are played for non-Hindu Balinese peoples, and so the ideas of why to perform certain kinds of music shift and are different, even if the material instruments are the organs of the instrument
Right.
are the same, more or less.
Because the cosmology would be different for, let's say, a Muslim community in even in Bali, right? Like they're not going to view the world in the same way as a Hindu Balinese individual. So the function of Bali Ganjur doesn't have any relevance because it's not useful in their cosmology.
Sure, for sure. Yeah. But the interesting thing too is there are some communities that use Balagandur that aren't Hindu Balinese that sort of use it as a similar thing, but that would be um, sort of anomalies, right, or things that are cast in a sort of different context. But back to the definition of Balagandur, that's really what it is for a lot of Hindu Balinese peoples, and so the reason they sort of see it, or we see it as an essential part of the community, is because it is almost always performed at beginnings of ceremonies, whether it's an odalan, like the birthday of a temple, or whether it's for a cremation ceremony, or whether it's for a renovation of a house or something like that. And there are contexts in which Balaganjur was not used, but there are still noisemakers. So there's literally like people holding bamboo noisemakers and hitting it really loud, right? And people just like yelling and screaming and things like that. But Balaganjur specifically is pretty unique in instrumentation, primarily because it's processional and it's easily moved, right? You can move around while performing it. So one, it's fairly inexpensive to buy relative to other kind of gamelan sets, and also because of the lack of carvings that is needed for the set. But generally, it's sort of the gamelan ensemble that uses more cymbals and rayong, or the knobbed pots, with one person typically playing one instrument. So the interlocking is a lot different too. You kind of have to expand. Ironically, you have to know more of the melody to play less of the music. Does that make sense? Like you have to know more of the melodic line in order to,
Oh,
well, by playing, in order to play just one pitched instrument, right? Or something
right.
like that.
Yeah. Because you don't have a set of pitches that is accessible to you, right? You have the one
Yes.
pitch. So you've got to know the overall uh, pitch structure or organization or pattern maybe in order to figure out where that one thing fits.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
you're only playing one note versus maybe two at a time, or
Right.
two of the notes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes
Yeah,
sense.
precisely.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that's really cool. I love the Balagantra has always been so unique to me, mainly in the fact that it's mobile. And I know that there are like mobile versions of like Onklung, for instance, but
Mhm.
pretty much every variety of gamelan is not meant to be moved around as you play. And as both of us know, moving a gamelan is a giant pain in the ass unless you've got a lot
Yeah.
of people, and then it's pretty easy. But if it
Especially
was me
no
and
one.
you moving your dad's gone kibyar, that would suck.
Yeah.
And the ability to move and play music as a cellist is something that I've always envied. I've always envied guitarists. You just throw on a
Mm.
strap, you can walk around stage. I'm stuck to whatever box that they stick me on. And so I love the being able to actually move through space as you perform. And talking a lot about the context of these things. That's such an experience because the context of what you're playing can change as you move through. Let's say if you're going from this spot to a temple,
Mhm.
you're always moving through different areas of a village or a city, and so you might not have to change what you're playing based on the context, but
Mhm.
you're always in a new setting as you take a step, and that I think has probably some profound impacts on how you're experiencing the music and perhaps even performing it.
For sure. I mean, is moving as a cellist something that's important to you, or just kind of something that you're like, oh, I wish I could do that on occasion?
I think moving is very important to me. I playing an instrument, especially playing, let's just say playing the cello. I see
Hmm.
playing the cello as a highly physical activity. It's a highly mental activity as well, but it's also highly physical. Um, and a lot of times when if you watch like classical performances, or even it doesn't have to be classical. Take two cellos or piano guys. More popular sort of modern cello performance. You see these guys move around in their seat all the time, and this isn't just some sort of like it's kind of serving it's a multifunctional activity. One, it does help to convey physically a feeling to the listener.
Right.
There's a if you ever watch a video of a cellist who just sits there and doesn't move and makes no facial expressions, very different than watching someone who's moving and emoting and making facial expressions to the music. There's a secondary communication of expression there. But the other thing that it does is physically, it just helps keep you loose and it helps keep you relaxed.
For
Um,
sure.
but also, it's possible to feel a high level of energy while you're performing, and being able
Yeah.
to actually move through space as you're playing. Take the classical example of the guitarist as he's playing a solo. He goes and stands next to the bassist, and then he goes and
Yeah.
looks at the
Yeah.
drummer. That adds a whole new dimension to not only the experience as an audience member visually, but also as the actual performer. So it is really important to me, and it's not that I don't care about sitting down all that much, but it is a different experience. Playing music when you're standing versus when you're moving is very different, because you can you get your footsteps matched with the music maybe, or
Mhm.
you start kind of moving, you start working with other people, especially if you're marching with, or at least moving with other people. Now you have you have a couple of whole new layers of expression. Not only are you
Yeah.
engaging in you know making sound, but you're also almost engaging in dance in a certain way, that
Sure. For sure.
you're feeding off of each other's movements, and that's you kind of get this feedback loop with what you're playing and what you're hearing, and that influences what you're feeling, and then that influences what you're hearing and playing as well, and then that goes back into it, and
Hmm.
it's a really amazing experience.
Yeah, I think the thing that you're describing here, the when I was first starting doing my master's degree, I came across some musical jargon and or academic jargon that I forget the author, but he was quoting John Blacking, who's sort of known for defining musicking, right? But this person came up with a term. I don't know if he actually did, but he used this term quite often, and it was musico-physiological responses.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
basically, what you were talking about in this one term, and I think you're entirely right. There's a certain sense of transferal and dissemination of affect when you're doing those things, especially to an audience that appreciates it or knows what you're kind of going through. And I go back and forth between this whenever I see, especially in gamelan or even in like rock music or something where people are like overtly smiling when they're playing.
Mhm.
Like maybe 10 years ago I was like, okay, that's cool, people are interacting with each other and they look like they're enjoying playing music. But now whenever I see it, I'm like, that's annoying. I don't understand why it's annoying, but like I'd rather watch someone like my dad or Pa Asnawa or
Mhm.
any of the Balinese musicians that are just completely stoic but that
Mhm.
can rip it, right? It's like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, obviously they can play music, whether they're they look like they're falling asleep or not is a different thing, right?
It's interesting because I think you could people do make the argument, musicians make the argument that, well, if you just sit there stone faced and don't move, then you're if someone is viewing you doing this, if they're listening to a recording, it doesn't matter, but if they're watching you do this, then you're going to fundamentally alter the way that they perceive the music. And I think there's a good argument for that. However, um, we're getting kind of back into a little bit of sort of just maybe not back into, but kind of this does tie into some maybe cultural sense and aesthetic sensibilities. There was a cellist, unfortunately he passed away 2009. Janos Starker. He was Hungarian. He fled during World War II, and he was a prodigy, but didn't have an instrument. And he had a really messed up life, mainly because of World War II, and he is known for being, he was described in reviews as like he was carved out of stone, or he was a piece of driftwood. He didn't move, and he barely had a facial expression, and most of the time his eyes were closed when he played. However, Starker became incredibly popular with the Japanese because he was sort of this non-Japanese portrayal of the samurai aesthetic, of this stoic, your work with a sword is art, not necessarily just battlecraft, but you're expected to be stoic and hard, and you are not expressing emotion unnecessarily. And he was incredibly popular in a large part for that reason. And his philosophy was that if you are doing this, then you are distracting the audience member from the music. You need to create excitement, not show it. And it's interesting because I find him an incredibly fascinating cellist to watch, perhaps because I'm a cellist and because I'm looking at things like technique and whatever, but because it's almost like his physical countenance is like the blank canvas on which his music actually ends up falling. And so I'm kind of with you. I can appreciate both things. I mean, there's something really exciting about watching two cellos just ruin bows and cellos doing this over and over again. But there's also something about watching, like your dad or Pasanawa just fucking crushing it and looking like it's a walk through the park, like it's nothing, like they're barely even trying, and you're just like, what? You're playing that? That's incredible. So.
Totally. And that's the thing is like some for the most part it comes down to intention and like what you're doing with the music, and obviously all these things come into play here whenever we're talking about the cultural context too, because I think even when people move while they're playing music, the way you move is also culturally codified, right? And this is, we won't get too much into trance today, but this is how a little bit of how I see trance working and how people move in different cultures when they're in trance, right? There's a reason that when Balinese people go into trance, it looks like this. There's a reason that when Ghanaian people go into trance, it looks like this, right? It's reaffirmed by your community, and I think within the context of Balagandra, you mentioned moving as one, processing with the community, and I think if you haven't experienced that in Bali or elsewhere, that's a really profound feeling, because you lose your sense of individualism and you move as a unit, right? And so that's how, like, I'll always get like, oh, how can people walk like miles with gongs and cymbals and play music down ravines and stuff and not get tired? And it's like, well, they do get tired, but their sense of purpose is different, and also you're doing it as a unit, so you sort of have a sort of obvious different sense of temporality. And if you know you're going to be going like 2 days with this thing, then you're not going to have a mindset, oh, I'll be done in like an hour, right? You don't make those parameters for yourself. And so with Balagandra, moving while playing is very important. And there's a term in Indonesian called gaya, Gaya, or Gaia. And I think you know of it a little bit because we try and do gaya in Tunas Mekar, when we perform, or Ade likes to try and push that a little bit, where we're moving as a unit, and it helps us musically. I think you're totally right. It helps us be more cohesive as a group. But a lot of academics don't. They sort of talk about Gaia as a peripheral thing, as just kind of a movement thing. But what I've noticed when I sort of try and describe it, and when I've researched different groups doing Gaia, is that there is a class difference to it. It tends to be performed by people that are privileged enough to do certain kinds of music or certain kinds of gamelan performances.
Mm.
And that is, you'll probably see more Gaia in competitions. You'll probably see more Gaia in at the bigger like Gongkabyar or Balagandra festivals, or the bigger festivals where it takes up like your ocular centrism is sort of displayed most, rather than like listening to the piece, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Wear more flashy things and you do more Gaia, and so
Yeah. It's like
in more.
you don't see this from a temple performance.
Yeah, exactly. You'll maybe like the drummer will do it to give cues or something,
Sure.
but you're
Yeah.
not going to see those in more rural places or more ceremonial contexts and things like that. Um, though I think that's changing a little bit with the generations, right? There are the sort of generations of
Mm.
experiencing Gaia through social media or seeing how the other village is having fun, and so it's making its way into more temple settings. But I think it's still so tied to, especially to Balagandra aesthetics, because as we were alluding to earlier, the lines between sacred and secular can really be seen in Balagandra, primarily because it's one of the most competitive kinds of gamelan in Bali. So apart from its traditional ceremonial context, it's also performed at like every festival, a lot of festivals, right? Um, and then in its festival context, there's a lot of choreography.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just performing processionals; it's performing cohesion through music and dance. So
Yeah.
it's obviously very important there, right? But there's not a lot of like individual Gaia, right? There's sometimes the cool thing about like Western classical musicians is that you have your own sense of individualism, and the way you move is slightly different or
Mm-hmm.
drastically different from the other person. Whereas in Bali, you try, if you're going to enact some kind of Gaia, it's meant to do as a
Mm-hmm.
group, right?
Yeah. There is some sense of group. Just just call it Gaia maybe in Western classical music. Well, we won't call it Gaia. I'll call it something else. There is in some scenarios a sense of we should all do this together.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like if you're ending a piece and you're going up bow and you're crescendoing and you're gonna do this thing.
Right.
If one of you does this and the rest of you just goes meh, it's not gonna look good. It looks really weird. It looks
Yeah.
like you're hot dogging over there that first violin.
Right.
So there is a situation, or there are contexts where it's like we should all do this together. So if you're like in an orchestra, you are not going to do any sort of physical emotion beyond what might come naturally to you as far as moving. Maybe if you have a facial, those things are kind of unconscious at a certain point.
Right.
But especially things like what is your bow doing, that's all prescribed. And so, you know, if you watch a video of like any professional symphony, you'll notice, hey, every single cello player is moving their bow at exactly the same time, and they're all in exactly the same place. That's all prescribed. Now that is a technical thing, but it does play into the visual element. If you're in a context like maybe a string quartet, or if you're playing a solo performance, yeah, then you get a lot of individuality, especially as a solo performer, because obviously completely individual.
Yeah.
So let's kind of circle back to the this kind of idea of the sort of blurring of the sacred and secular.
Mm-hmm.
You've talked a little bit about how Balagandra can function in a more secular space with things like competitions and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about how Balagandra might function if we move a little more towards the sacred end of that spectrum?
Sure. So Balagandra in its ceremonial context is intended to be performed and enacted um, in a couple different ways. And I say a couple different ways because I've had different answers by different people that I've talked to throughout my research. So the first sort of way that people like to talk about Balaganjo is that it's performed to dispel evil spirits or dispel dark energy or these sort of disruptive, intangible beings, right? So you perform this thing during a ceremony, and it's intended to get all of these intangible beings, entities away from the ceremony and get them away from the whole community, essentially. The other way it sort of functions is Balaganjur is used in temple ceremonies as a way to appease these what's called Bhutakala, or the darkness or the disruptive beings. Um, and by appeasement, I mean literally to entertain and keep the ceremony safe by keeping the evil spirits at bay with the group,
Would the
right? So,
word would the
for
word
example,
sorry.
oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, would the word distraction be appropriate? Maybe.
Yeah. We can
Okay.
use distraction. I like to use entertain because sometimes I, I use the word distraction too, but sometimes when I use distraction, it implies that there's a sort of ominous hidden agenda, and I think that's just it within my own head. But
Okay.
anyway, we could use distraction. So the second way is balaganders perform to distract evil spirits from the actual ceremony, and you can really see this when in context of like a processional where the priests and like the barang and rangda, or even the deceased body, is far down the road and the balagandur is sort of out or behind that particular batch of the community, right? So it's kind of like, okay, we'll keep the evil spirits over here while the what actually needs to happen is being safe, right? um, and in these contexts, you will almost always see the Balagandra performing on the street. So
Mm.
when we're talking about the lines between sacred and secular, the literal physical lines, it's really hard to say because Bali is known as the island of 1,000 temples because there are temples everywhere and there's
Everywhere.
offerings everywhere, literally littered on the ground, on the
Yeah.
street, everywhere. But when it comes to things that are perceived as dark entities, like witches or layak or the intangible, those things tend to be living on the street, like literally in the road. That's why when we go to Bali, my family is really adamant about don't go on the street after dark or something like
Mm.
that, right?
Okay.
Or after a certain kind of time, because it's perceived as this is the place where these things live, right? These are the places where things roam around,
No one ever told me
essentially.
that. It's the first time I'm hearing this. Dang it.
I think my dad's been fairly more lenient as his boys have grown up, being like, "Yeah, I think it's okay."
That tends to happen, I think.
Yeah,
Um.
yeah,
So. Yeah. So this idea of sort of entertaining or appeasing these spirits is a way to sort of make sure that they're not interfering with something else that's happening. Um. Is I that's coming from you is the first time I actually heard that when I was listening to the lecture that you gave last night. I was always under the impression that it was just this sort of that it was just sort of that everyone kind of thought of it as it was this function of dispelling or driving away, driving out. Which I don't know a lot about sort of the I'm struggling through Sakala and Escala. That book is to read.
yeah. It's pretty
So
dense.
yeah, so I haven't really gotten a really good grasp on how like what are the nature of these energies, these spirits. Um, but I think there is something a little universal about the idea of sort of dark and light energies, sort of order and chaos. And so the idea of that noise that chaos, maybe if you kind of want to look at it, if that's a appropriate way to look at it,
Yeah,
could dispel the spirits of it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense.
right.
Whereas this idea of, hey, let's make a lot of noise over here, and they like that, so they'll go over here, that makes a lot more sense, I think, as far as my understanding of the cosmology. um
Yeah,
yeah. So with the idea of using noise in this way, Baligandra being the vehicle. I want to ask you about one experience that I had in Bali, and if this lines up with this function. So you had this experience too because you were there, 2019 in the summer, during Ade and Aji's tooth filing ceremony. There was a point in time where there was a Dalong with the recording, and he was playing some instruments with his feet, which was really cool. And a Gonkabyar and a Slonding all playing at the same time within about 30 feet of each other. There was no Baligandra happening, but there was the priest was doing something on top of a platform. Was that kind of serving this function that you're talking about, that Baligandra?
Yes. So the term that people use in to describe that in particular is called rame, Rame, or Ramai. Rame is just an Indonesian term that means boisterousness or noisiness, right? Or excitement. And not just in a sonic sense, but the excitement of a party or the boisterousness of traffic or something like that. So this idea of rame is the thing that I'm talking about as a noise, as comfort, because in moments of silence in Balinese communities, that is the time that it's deemed that more ominous things are roaming around or more ominous things are existing, right? That's why from the lecture yesterday, I was talking about the day of silence in Bali called Nyepi, right? It's the one day out of the whole year where the airport gets shut down, the cars cease to move, everyone's in their homes, you're not playing music, you're not doing anything, you're intended to just sort of reflect. But more importantly, you are letting the Bhutakala or the dark entities, whether they're your ancestors or other sort of spirit beings, you allow them to occupy the space in which humans usually occupy, right? So in the context of what you were talking about, where we have all of these gamelan playing simultaneously, that is exactly what Baligandra is doing. And I don't know if you actually remember, but there was a Baligandra there.
There was briefly for a little bit, but not at the particular moment that I'm thinking about.
Right, okay. Yeah. So but do you remember who was supposed to play the Baligandra?
We were, yeah. And your dad was like, just play. And we were like, what do we play? He's like, play, just play something, play anything.
Yeah, we were just like, dude, just hit things.
And it was, there was some semblance of like, we kind of got a pulse going, we kind of got a gong going, and but your dad was definitely, we were waiting because we were like, he needs to tell us what to play, how to start, what are the oxels, whatever. And he's just like, it was the closest that I think I've ever seen your dad come to saying the F word. I think he was about to say, just fucking play, guys.
Well, that's the thing, right? It was because we had sort of established a rapport of trust between, the gamelan, within the gamelan, right? The GTM, we're like, oh yeah, we obviously trust each other to be really good musicians and trust each other as human beings. It was like, all right, this was where my dad and I were like, oh, all right, our fault here was providing sort of the necessity for, or explaining the necessity for certain kinds of music, because it was like, here's all these people that are really professional musicians and that I know can improvise because we've done it many times just on a whim, right? But then you get thrown into this context where we're like, play anything, and everyone just freezes. Everyone is just
and for me, I was aware of the function of Baligandra in the sense of its relationship to certain energies or spirits. In that moment, I was not thinking about that. What I was thinking of was like, we're in the middle of a ceremony. This is important. This is serving some kind of function. But and so I'm thinking like, the last thing that I want to do is to like ruin something, to like play badly, and then we haven't served our function, but that's one of the things that I love so much about my experience with gamelan and with your family and going to Bali is, I grew up in this very Western context, this Western classical context of, perfection is impossible, but it is a worthy goal to set for yourself. And there's this sense of like, everything needs to be polished, everything needs to be prepared. Preparation is like 90% of being a good musician. I think maybe in general, but especially in like Western classical music. and
Mhm.
being thrown into a context where you can be not only completely unprepared as far as musically what you're going to play, but completely unprepared as far as how to play the fucking instrument that you're handed, and that it's not a big deal, that it's just
Right.
that it's just you're there because you need to be there. It doesn't really. I don't want to say it doesn't matter what you play, but it doesn't matter if it's perfect or if it's what you're
Right.
supposed to play as far as the actual rhythms or melody or whatever, but that you're there to serve a sonic function and simply to create sound.
Yeah.
That's a very valuable lesson for me, and it's really helped me to think about music in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
But it also makes sense in the context of sort of serving a sacred function. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I I spend this is gonna sound weird. I spend a lot of time in the Catholic Church because it's my job.
Yeah.
Don't particularly want to be there beyond the fact that they're paying me and it's easy. And it's interesting because I'm starting to kind of see even in the Catholic Church this same kind of idea. So I don't know if you've ever been to a mass or anything, but during
Yeah.
the communion preparation, there's always a ringing of a bell,
Right.
and there's just one, whatever his name is. I don't want to say he's not a choir boy, but whatever the kid who's responsible for ringing the bell. There's just one kid who like keeps ringing at the wrong time. He keeps ringing it too early, and he rings it in the middle of when the priest is talking, which he's not really supposed to do.
Okay.
And I
That's
could
funny.
totally see the priest, give this look like you're disrupting this sort of holy thing. No, he just sort of he keeps going, and it's like, he's
Right.
there to serve a purpose, and it's not actually really this. It's not like in this case, God is going to be like, this guy can't ring a bell right,
You're right.
smited. It's and so yeah, it's really it's really I really value the fact that playing gamelan and learning about Balinese culture to the small extent I've been able to really change the way that I see the function of music and functions of music, I guess.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what's cool, in my opinion, about something like Balagandro is because you do have the spectrum of performance and subsequently performativity, where you're enacting certain kinds of social change. But when you're talking about where it's seemingly more important, the music doesn't have to be perfect, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
largely more participatory. Like
Yes.
even in a
Yeah.
processional, if you were to walk with the Balagandro group, if you don't get handed a rayong pot or a chang chang at some point, then it's like it's probably not Balagandra or something, right? But with that, Balagandra, as it's known in like a competitive setting, you are attempting to attain perfection because
Mm-hmm.
you're doing all these things where the music is so precise and the choreography is so precise, and anything that goes wrong in a competition, you get scolded by the audience. Like they'll literally like point and laugh, right?
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't, you should see, I mean, this happens at Gongklabir competitions too, but like, especially with Balagandru competitions, they tend to have a lot of like pyrotechnics going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember one time one of um, the pyres that were created caught on fire, which
Oh
made,
yeah.
and it fell over, and it made for the person that it fell on to freak out, you know,
Understandably. Yeah.
fair enough. But everyone, the whole arena just erupted in laughter and started pointing, and was no one was like, I hope that guy's okay. They were just like, haha, they fucked up.
I think I was there for that. I think
You may have been there. I think you actually
that
were
was
there.
2016. Yeah. They
Yeah,
had
because
a
we had come down, we got like special seats,
mm-hmm.
but they weren't actually special.
No, they weren't that great. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
there was this giant um like wooden structure, looked
Yeah.
like wooden or bamboo or reeds or something. I wasn't close enough, and it was too long ago for me to really remember. It was carried by a few people, and there
Yeah.
were fireworks on top of it or sparklers or
Right.
something like that. And then there were these streamers they were pulling out, and the dancers were like weaving these streamers together as they danced. It was really fascinating. But yeah, those sparklers caught the thing on fire, and I remember as soon as someone saw it, they were like, we got to get this back, and they rushed it back behind, but it was
Yeah.
taller than the wall, so you could still see it on fire back there.
Right. Right.
I do feel bad for laughing. I did not know that it fell on somebody. I feel bad for laughing about that. But it
They
was
were fine, I'm sure. It's
it's
part
just
of the
fire.
spectacle and part of the sport of it, right? Which is hilarious to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, is there anything else that you like to talk about in regards to this idea of kind of the function of noise? If not, I'd like to move more back into the conversation of kind of delineating noise versus music a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can comment on it with as we transition into talking about that, and that is part of my own research is that I was seeing in a lot of ethnomusicological texts and people's studies within anthropology and things like that, that a lot of time they would have a study of one particular music and really delve into it, which was nice, right? So here's a book on Balagandra, a person really delved into it. Here's a book on Japanese noise music, and someone really delved into it. Or here's a book on heavy metal in the Balkans, and someone delved into it. Whatever. So what I really was noticing in how I've approached it and how I'm seeing this sort of separation between certain kinds of secularisms and sacredisms was that I really wanted to look at heavy metal in Bali because it's a huge scene, not only in
Mm,
Bali but in
mm,
Indonesia. Heavy metal and Balaganjur. And the reason I wanted to look at those two things is one, I'm really interested in both of those things as a practitioner and composer. But two, I was noticing that some of the peoples that were playing and composing Balaganjur were also the people that were in the heavy metal scene,
mm,
right? And there's a tendency sometimes to think of those things as separate categories, right? It's like, oh, the people that are more globalized or more cosmopolitan play this kind of music. The people that are more traditional and harbor a certain kind of cosmology or spiritual being play this kind of music. There wasn't a lot of people talking about the sort of contention or the conflation or the hybridity, or that those two places actually intersect in places like Bali,
right.
right? Obviously not everywhere, but in places like Bali, there tends to be it's there's the space is more susceptible to people occupying different kinds of identities and different kinds of spaces simultaneously.
Right.
And so that's really where I was looking at the actual line between secularism and sacredism that tended to stem from the sonic space,
Mm,
how people were playing music. Because yes, there's a lot of people that listen to heavy metal and are like, I don't like that at
mm,
all. But they
mm.
listen to Balagandra and they're like, this needs to happen. If it doesn't happen, I'm uncomfortable, right? That
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
thing. But from a practitioner and from a composer's sort of standpoint, those two musical platforms tend to be similar in aesthetic and in sensibility. Um, so I found that really, really interesting and really a really poignant point into talking about music as it relates to, again, cosmology, and then it sort of cast out into environmentalism and then politics in on the island
Hmm.
specifically.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
So before we move on, we have one viewer. Do you want to guess who it is?
Oh man. Could be so many people. I have no idea.
Who do you think is right there with you as far as their love of heavy metal and Bolly Ganjer?
Is it Luke
It is
Gini?
Lugini. Across the pond, he gave us a lot of comments.
Cool.
There's no timestamp, so I don't know when these are relevant. Uh, but he said one of the comments. He says, "Challenge: write a piece with parts and corresponding time signatures for each type of concurrent Powhatan week."
Concurrent what?
Time signatures, corresponding time signatures with each type of. He says Powhatan, Pawukon week.
Oh, is he meaning the days of a Balinese calendar?
Yeah, I think so.
I see. I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that'd be a very numeric undertaking.
Yeah, you'd have to explain that to me a little bit more. I'm not sure I'm following, but so differentiating between noise and music, this I think is a conversation that's gone on for as long as we've been making the distinction. What is the distinction?
Yeah.
We've got there's evidence of people making music, 50,000 years ago. The oldest instruments are bone flutes, found in Africa, which is just, they're, they got two holes, so they can play basically four pitches, if that. And I think I've had a conversation with an individual at one point who was trying to make this argument that, like, well, of course there's a God that created everything. How do you think we came up with music? And I'm just like, I don't think it's a hard stretch for someone, 50,000 years ago who's bored out of his fucking mind because all he has to do all day is collect berries and sleep, to go, hey, this log sounds funny. You know what? I can do that twice in a row. I can do it 3 times in a row. I can do one longer and one shorter. Hey, how about that? It's not a stretch to think that someone kind of developed this idea of rhythm first, but you've also got musical sounds all around you. If you want to extend that label in the terms of animal noises, I know I just mixed up my terms there, but I think that it's a really important conversation, and I think that it's always going to be shifting, not only as an individual, not as an individual, but also in the context of different cultures. So, for instance, like we hold up in classical music, Stravinsky's Rite of Spring was this. It's this monument of composition and orchestration and creativity, and it's so original and it's so unique, and it was so, nowadays it's solidified in the canon. You've got excerpts of Rite of Spring in every single anthology you could possibly think of. It's studied on a musicological level, on a theoretical level. It's sort of, oh yeah, it's Rite of Spring. It's crazy, isn't it? But it literally caused a riot when it was first performed.
Right.
And it was seen as, this is not music, this is noise. And so culturally in the West it's just forget about just culturally in the West, well, specifically Western academia, our perspective on what Stravinsky is, and specifically that piece, has shifted from this is noise and it's disruptive and it's counterproductive to it's canonized in the academic sphere. So I'm going to say, let's say I'm starting from zero. I know that there's probably a difference between noise and music. I got two categories and I can kind of stick things in them and maybe in between them. How can we go about, as an individual, figuring out where to put things in those different categories? And I know it's not as black and white and cut and dry as that, but how could we go about figuring out the delineation between noise versus music?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. These are topics that have been talked about for many centuries, and no one seems to have a definitive answer, right? And I think that's primarily because there isn't a definitive answer, or this is sort of the discursive nature of the concept of noise in music, where it's shifting with changing cultural idioms and cultural processes, and for certain kinds of contexts, right? So, but I think, it seems like more and more, as the world is getting more globalized and as people are becoming more cosmopolitan, there is a tendency to think of certain things as sort of being universal truths, and that one or more peoples will experience this thing as the same thing, even from different cultural groups, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not hard to really make the argument, if you're from the same sort of cultural process with whatever parameters that is, that they would think very similarly in some capacities. But with music and noise, so there's music, which I more or less have defined as like humanly organized, and then noise as a disruption of status quo. And then there are people that perform and categorize themselves as noise musicians, right? So what that tells me is that there is a separate category that's not music, that's not noise, but using noise as your instrument or as your sound source to humanly organize something in the sonic world, something with certain kinds of sonorities, right? um, I don't know that I have a good answer for this, because the first thing that I think about is, do you know, have you heard of this artist Peter Valek?
Mm-hmm.
Valek? I don't,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
you've seen him, right?
Oh yeah.
So he does like found objects,
Mm-hmm.
or creates different installations. And I haven't really seen him in any of his posts refer to the things that he's doing as noise or music, for that matter. It's just a thing that he's doing,
Yeah. Mm.
just an activity, right?
Mm.
So I don't know. This is when I get a little confused myself with whether categories even um, are useful to me. Um, I will respond with an anecdote though. So one of my good friends from Jimbaran, Bali, who is a pretty active social media guy, and he's a big composer of gamelan, but specifically of heavy metal and balaganjur. I He posted one of Peter Valek's videos on Facebook, and before I even read his comment, I was like, "Oh, he's totally gonna like this," because of what I sort of put in my head about noise and balaganjur and stuff like that. But his comment on it was basically making fun of the whole thing. He was like, "This is not music at all. Why is this even a thing?" And like, this is very different than what I know to be a musical practice in any way. And we had gotten into a conversation, and I sort of described my thoughts on it, in being like, if he defines it as music, if the activity that he thinks he's doing is in some way organized in his head, or his practice is at least organized as music, then that's how, I guess we don't have to see it that way, but that's how he sees it. So in some capacity, it is music, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I started thinking about like how the Islamic call to prayer for Muslim peoples, although it has musical qualities, it's not perceived as music, right?
Yes.
Music is a very different thing. The Islamic call to prayer is the word of God,
Yeah. Yeah.
specifically, right?
Singing in the Quran as well. I mean,
Right.
I this is gonna vary depending on the community of Muslims. But for a lot of Muslims in the Middle East, the imams and priests and other varieties of holy. I was gonna say holy individuals, but it's always holy men. I guess we should be clear about that.
Yeah.
They are generally it's pretty much
Yeah.
the standard. They are expected not only to memorize the whole Quran, but to be able to sing it, and there actually are in culturally dependent prescribed pitches. But
Right.
yeah, again, it's not viewed as performance, it's not viewed as art, it's viewed as just recitation, basically.
Right.
And it's been a while, and I don't remember why it needs to be quote unquote sung. Again, they have a completely different word for it than the word for sing in some of these communities. But yeah, I think when it comes down to figuring out the difference between noise and music, I think those two things are nested in each other, and
Yeah.
I'm not so convinced anymore that there needs to be a delineation in the same way of like, what's the difference between music and heavy metal? Right? It doesn't really make any sense.
Right.
And so, really, I think maybe the categories, if there needs to be categories, should be music and not music. Kind of
Mm-hmm.
just be, let's really just straightforward with the contrapositive there. John Cage talked a lot about listening to what people would call noise as music, and he was not referring to quote unquote organized noise or noise that at least has some kind of control placed over it. Peter
Right.
Valek, he picks the materials that he is using. He's not using every material. He's using a particular set of materials for a particular set of reason. It may be random what he's picking. It may be that he opens his basket of whatever materials he's collected and just goes, let me pick this thing out, maybe, I'm not convinced that he's doing that all the time, if he does that at all. And so John Cage talked about being able to perceive natural noise that is simply created out of multitudes of individuals interacting or nature, and being able to listen to that the same way that you would listen to, I think the example that he gave was a symphony, but you could pick your example there. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, I've been a big fan and non-fan of John Cage for a while, for probably the same reasons as you.
Go back and
But
forth for sure.
yeah, definitely. I'm like, oh, that's cool, and then I look at the other thing. I'm like, yeah, okay, all right, relax. um, but when I think of things like Rite of Spring and Stravinsky, there's certain kinds of musical sensibilities embedded within it that are the things that were the stimuli for riots, right? It wasn't. I don't. In my mind, I don't think it was the piece as a whole that created the riot, right? There were just there are some certain kinds of elements, whether it was the pitch content or certain kinds of rhythms that existed in the piece that really were quote unquote triggering for people at the time, right?
If I remember correctly, it was specifically the scene where the virgin is dancing herself to death.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Yes. Because it's deemed as paganistic and
yes,
demonic.
She was also, I believe, nude, and she was, you know, very, very underage. So I think that was possibly
right. So there's a lot of things going on there.
Yeah.
But people were just overwhelmed.
But I think you're right in that it wasn't like everyone was just like chill with it until that one scene. It was that was likely the breaking point. And it was it was the pitch content, the rhythmic structure, everything leading up to that. And that was probably already pushing people to the edge. And then you get the scene with a naked underage girl dancing herself to death, and people just going, in I looked up, it's 1913. France, probably pretty Catholic. You can understand where people go with that. I mean, if I saw it today, I'd probably be like, really?
Right.
But maybe
I think that's interesting. That, I mean, obviously the whole event is, but to just thinking more about it, noise at certain times or things that are noisy, whether it's music or whether it's sound or otherwise ideology, it tends to be the exploitation or the exposure of the human. And I'll explain what I mean here. Is in that context, you're exposing humanity through the human body that is seldom seen for that time period. For another example, when we were doing Banen Mual at Dazzle, remember there's a part in that Balagandro piece where we're screaming, right? That's the only time we're using our human bodies to produce sound internally, right? We're obviously we're playing with the cymbals and rayong and gongs and stuff, but that was the only moment in which we were using the human voice to sort of disrupt a little bit. It fit with the aesthetic of what was happening, I think. But it was a point in which most of us smiled and we looked at each other like, oh, okay, this is kind of weird. And when I was listening to the audience, watching it, there were some snickers, those that I could hear through everything. But I think this is a really important precedent in Buto dancing from Japan too, where the noise that you're creating is you're exposing the things that are human about people that are seldom seen, right? The reason that Buto dancing is so jarring is not because they're doing weird things, but you're moving in a way in which people sort of do naturally, but the people that do those things naturally are seen as sort of charismatic or off-putting or mentally disabled people in your community, the different kind of people in your village, so to speak, or in your collective. So I think that's what's interesting, is like it's like we've been so saturated or creating a fabricated life or an image of ourselves that the things that are noisy now are actually the things that are most human about us, in a sense. Maybe you agree with me, maybe not. Your volume is really low for some reason.
My fault.
Can't. There you go.
This is kind of like the Keeping Up with the Kardashians phenomena, in the sense of there is this sort of fake life that's portrayed in movies and TV shows, and oftentimes when there is media out there, and especially more and more nowadays, that is normalizing sort of non-standard, or sort of non I'm mixing up my terminology here. They're denormalizing, I think, maybe some of the, like let's take the obvious, in that the family structure is man, woman, and 2.5 kids.
Uh-huh.
More and more now you're seeing media where you're seeing homosexual relationships, homosexual parenting. You're seeing even polyamorous parenting or relationships in some TV shows and movies, and they're not being portrayed as this is the unhealthy, this is the abnormal. They're being portrayed as this is the normal. And I
Right.
think with music, this might be happening as well. We are, especially pop music, we've built a culture in the industry um, that is made to communicate to the lowest common denominator between every individual. And I say that as someone who enjoys some pop music. I'm not here being like, I'm too good for pop music. No, I'm not. There's some stuff out there it's catchy, and I know it's shitty, but it's still catchy. I'm not above admitting that. But I think more and more you are seeing people who are wanting to individualize themselves more. I think this tends to happen perhaps in waves. But the idea of taking something that's seen as abnormal, or as sort of the outside, and saying, actually, the only reason that it's in this category is a matter of perception. The only reason that we've taken these things and put them in this guy, his nervous laughter is something a lot of times that I think puts people off a lot. If you ever met someone who has nervous laughter a lot, it can be really off-putting, and a lot of times people can be like, that guy's just stop.
Right.
But nervous laughter is literally just that. It's nervous laughter, and it's not necessarily indicative of any sort of mental illness. So I think I got a
Right.
little off track on that one, but I think maybe you see where I'm going with that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It does. It does. I mean, it is. That's the thing that we were talking about in terms of what we're sort of categorizing as noise, and these sort of anomalies to the status quo that are exposing our humanity. And I think, for the most part, that's what's happening with performances of Balagandra for protest, for example. So, like, in the South Bay of Bali, pretty recently, there was a whole organization and organizations feeding money into trying to create this tourist playground, right? Which all of Bali kind of already is, but this was supposed to be this like ethereal, looking like Dubai kind of
Mm-hmm.
isolated place for tourists to come play.
Weren't they gonna build an island like they did in
Yeah,
Dubai?
exactly. So
Yeah.
they were going to, the term was reclamation, land reclamation, which in environmentalism terms is actually a good thing, because when you reclamate land, you're intending to reorient the land to sort of boost the ecosystem or feed it, right?
Mm-hmm.
In these the hot term here is in sustainable ways. But in this context, land reclamation would mean that you're moving so much land that you're actually being a detriment to not only the ecosystem there, but the livelihoods of the people there. And so when there were the protests that were happening by a lot of the youth, primarily youth men in Bali of that area, there was not only a lot of rock music, but there was balagandro being played and creating that rame, right? Creating that cacophony to expose not only the corruption of local Balinese government with the foreign investors, but also to expose the actual humanity that's being ostensibly taken down if this thing goes through, right? Like you're taking away how people know to be when you're placing this tourist playground. Um, and so I think, yeah, if we associate noise with these sort of political movements and these things that happen in a collective community, then that's where I would leave it at. Um, but in terms of noise as a source potential for music, I think they're not different conversations, but they are.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a whole big fucking mess of intertwined terms and definitions, and but I think it's important to talk about these things as function, and you know, maybe I know I brought up the whole conversation about how do we decide where to apply these labels, but at the end of the day, it really is a label, and I think the function is that's where the interesting conversation tends to happen. Whether you want
Yeah,
to call it noise or music, it's sort of, as long as we agree on what it is, then kind of fine there. Um,
right.
the We talked earlier about or you referenced earlier about Nyepi, which I
Mhm.
think throws into or throws out any questions of, you know, someone ever was wondering how seriously are these concepts of spirits and energy taken. The fact that an entire island's economy would shut down for an entire day is
Mhm.
a pretty big deal. Um, what's the preparation for Nyepi? There's a holiday that, or another day that happens kind of in preparation for Nyepi. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's a few days that happen, but the day before Nyepi is called Ngrupo, Ngrupuk, Ngrupo, and this is the day that is sort of the antithesis of Nyepi, right? It's inviting all the dark energy and the evil spirits onto your plane of existence. You make as much noise as possible. You dress up in these demonic characters and with makeup that's very dark entity, and you create these things called ogoh ogoh, Ogoh times two. But they're these giant statues made. They used to be made out of foam and bamboo and things that were like trash, but now they're trying to recycle like plastic and stuff to make
Cool.
it more eco-friendly. But yeah, so they create these large pyres of Butakala statues, and at the end of the night, you destroy them.
Hmm.
So it's just a raucous event. It's a really cool event, and I always make this joke, but it falls on people because it's an obscure joke that only I think is funny. But ngarupuk is similar. The word is similar to karupuk, which is
Oh,
krupuk are those shrimp
yeah,
crackers that
yeah.
like everyone eats with the meals, right? And you've eaten them.
I love
It
them.
When you eat those, they're sort of chaos and noisy in your mouth.
Yeah,
Like they're sort of like shrimp cracker pop rocks,
yeah,
and so
yeah,
I find the chaos in the mouth to be very similar to Marupok the day before Nyepi, where you're creating this cacophony. Um, and I
yeah.
think,
Incidentally, Chaos in the Mouth would be a wonderful band name. But continue. Sorry.
yeah, I'm surprised no one's come up with that yet. Maybe someone has.
Just do it.
Right on. Um, a lot of Balinese people I've heard sort of describing the era of COVID as an extended nyepi, because
Hmm.
that's essentially what we're doing. We're staying indoors, or some of us are. If hopefully more people do so. Um, but you're asked to stay indoors and sort of self-reflect in these ways that connect with an intangible in some ways.
Hmm.
So, but yeah, the preparation for Nyepi is I believe roughly 10 days, and all of those days are ceremonies. Whether you're doing um, pig slaughter for food for the village or something, or it's similar to Galungan, um, where it's sort of the demarcating your temporal stamp or the birthday of the village and things like that. Um, but yeah, all of this is the culmination of it is silence, which is wild.
This
Yeah,
idea of communication with spirits or spiritual energy. Heard you kind of describe it both ways. I'm not really sure which is the to look at it, but this idea of communication with sort of spirits or spiritual energy seems to be um, pretty front and center in Bali. Offerings made every day. In fact, there was one time last year when I was there, I was coming back to the village and I stopped at a Circle K or something to get a drink, and had to wait to pay because there was one girl working there and she was busy making an offering to take out front. You know, and it seems to be very front and center to Balinese cosmology, religion, and subsequently life. Um, so in and I know that you could go on for a while about this, and we're about at the end of our time, and I want to respect your time. But what are some sort of other factors besides music that come into play with the communication between sort of the physical world and the spiritual world?
yeah, that's that could be a very long conversation. But when we're talking about Balinese cosmology, we're we're especially sort of Hindu Balinese cosmology. We're dealing with the praxis of indigeneity on the island, which is very different than the spiritual ideology of Agama Hindu Dharma, which is the actual religion, which is syncretic sort of in nature, syncretic between the indigenous, again, practice of spirituality in Bali and the sort of Hinduism that comes from India and comes from Java that was apparent during the Majapahit Empire, the sort of Hindu empire that was in Indonesia between roughly 13th and 16th century. Um, so when we're talking about those kinds of things, the sort of more indigenous entities of cosmology tend to be the things that are like animism, for example. So animism, like this, the the spirits of the instruments or the spirits of the tools that you're using to better to make your life easier, or the spirits of your natural environment, those kinds of things. So part of the reason there's an offering or a ceremony for quite literally everything at
Mm-hmm.
this point. Like, you make offerings for your cars
Cars,
and
yeah.
yeah, things that make your life easier. Is this tie, the tie from ceremony to attributing certain inanimate objects as having a spiritual connection. Those tend to be a little more on the indigenous belief of Bali, and then that being tied more with the Hinduism that it has been syncretized. And I want to be clear that it's called Hindu because when the Dutch colonized Indonesia, they attempted to implement a government that said that whoever is occupying this area, you have to ascribe to one of the five primary religions, right? Whether it's Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Catholicism, etc. and the closest thing to indigenous sort of Balinese cosmology at the time was Hinduism. So it sort
Yeah.
of created this their own
I was gonna
category
say
of
I'm
this.
glad they didn't choose Catholicism, but that seems to be not even close to a choice anyway. But
Yeah, maybe
can you imagine
there's
Bali as a Catholic island?
there's a few. I think there's a few either Christian or Catholic churches in Bali of Balinese people that actually use gamelan as their primary sound source too, which I find fascinating. One of my friends
That is
does research
interesting.
down there. I don't know too much about it, but if interested, he's a person to contact because that's a mesh in different ways.
Yeah.
Um, but other things other than music, there's dance obviously is really important, and honestly, dance and music were not really separate for Balinese arts uh, until other sort of expressive arts flourished, but through also the we'll call it the academification or people that sort of were anthropologists and people that wanted to analyze everything started to break categories down, right?
Mm.
So they were like, okay, this is the music, this is the dance, they're separate things. Well, in actuality, it's one sort of
Mm-hmm.
art form, right?
Gotcha. Right. In
um,
in the same way of like, just to draw an analogy, maybe the same way that like ballet is not music plus dance, right?
right.
It's the combination of the two. It's sort of the sum is greater than the whole of the parts. That
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
idea. Yeah.
exactly. So that's another sort of obvious important part of Balinese, not only artistic life, just in general, just Balinese life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then trance, I would put up there as being sort of this very important performance for cosmological balance, trance as for spirit medium and things like that. Um, it's rare that you'll find trance without sort of the music and then um, or people dancing when they're in trance.
Mm-hmm.
There are instances in which that happened, but these kinds of things happen very frequently, right? Like in whether whatever ceremony it is, but I think those kinds of things are, especially the spirit possession, spirit medium kind of thing, is really important, um, because those tend to be the times where certain things get decided, right? It's like, okay, I want to build this house on this land, but it's not my land. We have to confer with the people that exist right now, but we also have to confer with the ancestors of the past. And so you have these moments where you go to the Balian or the spiritual uh, being that sort of or spirit medium that can communicate these things. And so that becomes really important, and that has really tangible effects, obviously, right? Because it's like, okay, I'm not going to build this house if my great great grandmother said like hell no, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah,
So
you can't really say fuck off to your spirit grandma, right?
yeah, not a good move
That
on that
seems like
one.
it's a bad idea. Yeah.
Um, yeah,
The form that offerings take has always interested me. Especially the offerings to, since we're talking so much in this conversation about darker side, the sort of more chaotic side of the spirit world. Can
mhm.
you talk a little bit about what offerings to that side of things tend to look as like physical objects?
Yeah. So the most drastic thing that they tend to look like are offerings of sacrificed animals.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you remember being in Bali and one of the puppies were covered up, right? While you all were
They were, yeah. Although this is gonna come across wrong. Please don't anyone take this the wrong way. I am sorry I missed it. Because you know, yeah. I mean, culturally, killing. I mean, for me, culturally, animal sacrifice is just sort of something that I just kind of go, um,
there. Yeah,
this. It's not part of my culture, and culturally, I do view it as something rather barbaric. However, I do understand that it is an important and integral part of practices in other cultures,
right.
and I'm not ready to go, hey, you guys should stop that. Um,
Right.
I do understand why it was kept a little bit on the side from us.
Yeah, from you all.
But I am, you know, I want to, if I'm interested in other cultures, and I don't want things to, I don't want to avoid things because they make me uncomfortable. That's not the right way to go about learning anything, to avoid things that are making you uncomfortable. I think the
Right.
process of learning entails putting yourself in a place where you are uncomfortable. But yeah, I do remember that there were some chickens as well, I believe.
Yeah. So the thing about reincarnation is a huge thing
Hmm.
in Balinese cosmology, and you know that. And so the belief here is that anything that is a sentient being that gets sacrificed is guaranteed a higher spot in the reincarnation round, if not already um, uh, going away from the reincarnation cycle or attaining what's called moksha, right? Going to what would similar to like heaven or something like that. Some
Maybe
place where
like
you
Nirvana, perhaps. Since we're
yeah,
talking about
yeah,
okay.
right, right. Um, and so to appease sort of the darker beings, there are still a lot of very violent things that happen, obviously. And to be clear, I'm not, I don't condone them as well, but I do, as a similar person, understand the necessity for it for people that believe very strongly
Yeah,
about a very particular kind of way. And this I find interesting is that I have a lot of animal rights activist friends in Bali, like veterinarians and people that are like, we should take care of animals, that will simultaneously, confirm that these ceremonies still need to happen, right? Like without this ceremony, the harmony of the village is, or the village will not have this sort of cosmological harmony. And
yeah,
I find that very, it's compelling because it's
yeah.
like on one hand, you're advocating for the life of these sentient beings. On the other, you see contexts in which these things need to happen in order for your own world to sustain, right?
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't view animal sacrifice as animal cruelty. I don't now like if someone is just wandering around slitting puppies' throats, we
Yeah,
should probably stop that guy.
right.
But if it is done, like if somebody who would not normally do that ends up doing that because they feel that it is necessary cosmologically, listen. At the end of the day, I disagree with them. I don't see it that way. However, I'm not going to then put them in the category of this is an animal abuser, this is an animal murderer, or something like that,
Right.
because it's not. That's not really what's happening.
Yeah.
Also, if I was not aware of the fact that animals kind of participated in this reincarnation cycle, so that throws a completely different light on it, because in some way maybe you're not actually murdering, you're not really killing the thing.
Hmm.
You may even view it as like you're freeing it from its body, which
Right.
may
Right.
come with a whole package
Maybe.
of rather problematic
Yeah.
consequences. But yeah, anyway, so is it true that trash burning is viewed as a bit of an offering to for these dark energies?
Uh,
Because that's something I've heard repeated over and over again, and I no one has confirmed it, and I haven't seen it. At least not that I'm aware of.
well, can I ask by who you've heard it from? Is it by Balinese people?
No,
Okay.
I've never heard a Balinese person tell me that, which is why
Yeah.
I'm
All right.
skeptical.
All right. Had you said that a Balinese person told you that, my response would be, um, an anecdote, which is that there was one time where I had, CC students, or one of the CC students asked, we were at a temple ceremony and they asked about this particular, it was a very charismatic looking stick that this person was holding. So it looked very spiritual and it looked very exotic. And the person was like, oh, what is the cultural significance of this stick that you're holding? And the Balinese person gave this really spiritual answer. And then he turned to me and he's like, they don't know that it's just a stick that I found like 2 seconds ago on the ground, that kind of thing. So if a Balinese person had told you that trash burning was some offering or something like that, that's probably why they would say it.
Right.
They'd be
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
okay, here, I'll just give you this answer so you're happy. But no, trash burning is still just
Just
trash
trash
burning.
burning.
And
That's kind of what I figured. Yeah.
yeah,
Um.
which luckily they're not doing too much of anymore.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's which is good. You know, one of the things that you've, and I'm gonna we're gonna, this is a good place to wrap it up because
Cool.
we've gone quite a while. But one of the there's so many more topics that I would love to pick your brain about. But one of the things that you've been focusing on a lot is environmentalism. And that's something that I've been learning about a little bit lately, as far as some of the environmental movements in Indonesia, specifically with is it the Leusen area in Sumatra? I'm
I don't think
fucking that name up
the ones
probably.
with the orangutans.
Yeah, I think so. It's got rhinos too and elephants maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah. So the environment, there's uh it seems like there's a lot of really cool environmental movements in Bali coming out of Bali. Um,
Mhm.
but all right, man. I think this is good enough place to wrap it up as any.
Cool.
Anything else you'd like to throw out there before we log off? Before we say goodbye?
No, that was it. I mean, we can save the. Yeah, we'd love to talk to you more about anything in environmentalism, but this has been good to keep on track. We didn't stray away too bad.
No, we didn't. I don't think so.
That's
Yeah,
pretty good.
if anyone did, it was me. That's for sure.
Which luckily they're
Um,
not doing too much. Yeah, that's it. But thanks for having me on, and it's always good to talk to you, brother,
you too, man.
whether formally or informally. And hopefully we can get back to playing gamelan sometime soon.
Agreed. Agreed. All
Sweet.
right.
All right, Joe.